She couldn't scream anymore. Her throat was too dry, her voice a rasp against the darkness. Eliza Whitmore pressed her hands against the wooden panel, the wall her parents had sealed shut 3 days ago. Or was it 4? She'd lost count. The lock on her bedroom door had been the first warning. The whispered arguments downstairs. The second. But when her father had forced her into this crawl space behind the attic wall, when her mother had stood silent as he hammered the panel into place, Eliza understood. There would be no wedding, no Jonathan, no life at all. She scratched one final word into the floorboards with her mother's brooch. Help. And then Eliza Whitmore, 19 years old, disappeared from history. The obituary would blame scarlet fever. The town would forget. Her grave would be marked, but empty. For 54 years, no one knew, until a gray stray cat with amber eyes led a schoolteacher named Margaret Harlow to that exact spot. Every day for 6 weeks, the cat sat at the attic wall and waited. And when Margaret finally tore through the false paneling, she found the trunk, the letters, the journal, and the skeleton of a girl who'd been murdered by her own family. This is the story of how a cat solved a crime buried for half a century, and how one family's darkest secret was finally brought to light. If you want the full story, smash that like button and stay with me. This one will haunt you. Margaret and Thomas Harlow purchased 47 Ridgewood Lane in late September of 1947. It was a steal, far below market value, and the realtor had been almost too eager to close the deal. The house was a towering Queen Anne Victorian, built in 1889, with peeling white paint, sagging gables, and windows that rattled in the wind. It had been vacant for nearly 2 years. The previous owners, an elderly couple named the Dunbars, had moved to a senior home after Mrs. Dunbar's health declined. No heirs claimed the property. No one wanted it. Margaret, a schoolteacher with a love for restoration projects, saw potential. Thomas, a bookish accountant, saw charm. Their 2 children, 8-year-old David and 5-year-old Lily, saw endless rooms to explore. They moved in on a gray Saturday, the kind of afternoon where the clouds hung low and the air smelled of damp leaves. The house groaned as they carried boxes inside, floorboards protesting under their weight. But it felt alive in a way their cramped apartment never had. Ash arrived 3 days later. Margaret found him on the back porch, huddled beneath a wicker chair. He looked half-starved, his gray fur tangled with burrs and dirt. She knelt down, extended a hand, and the cat didn't flinch. He simply blinked at her, slow and deliberate, as if recognizing her. She brought him inside, fed him leftover chicken, and by evening, Ash had claimed a spot on the living room couch. Thomas joked that the cat came with the house. Margaret wondered if he might have. Ash adapted quickly. He followed the children through hallways, napped in sunlit corners, and purred loudly when anyone scratched behind his ears. But within the first week, his peculiar habit began. Every day around 3 o'clock, Ash would trot to the base of the attic stairs, a narrow enclosed staircase tucked behind a door in the upstairs hallway, and sit. He'd stare upward, unblinking, and meow. Not the soft chirp of a house cat asking for treats, but a low, insistent sound that made Margaret's skin prickle. "What's up there, Ash?" she'd ask, half-joking. The cat would glance at her, then back at the stairs, as if the answer were obvious. Margaret climbed the attic stairs twice in those early weeks. The space was large but cramped, filled with the detritus of previous owners. Old furniture draped in sheets, trunks with rusted locks, a dress form missing its head. The air smelled of mothballs and wood rot. Ash would follow her up, walk directly to the far wall beneath the western gable, and sit. He'd stare at the wall for minutes, sometimes hours, ignoring her entirely. Margaret searched for holes, for signs of mice or squirrels. She found nothing. Thomas dismissed it. "Cats are odd," he said. "Maybe he hears something in the walls." But Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that Ash wasn't reacting to sound. He was reacting to something specific, something he wanted her to see. The children loved Ash. David taught him to bat at a string tied to a stick. Lily dressed him in doll clothes, and Ash tolerated it with surprising patience. They never noticed his obsession with the attic. To them, he was just their cat. But Margaret noticed. And as October bled into November, Ash's behavior intensified. He'd scratch at the attic door if it was closed. He'd pace at the base of the stairs, tail lashing. Once, Margaret woke at 2 a.m. to find Ash sitting on her chest, staring down at her with those amber eyes, meowing softly until she got up and followed him, straight to the attic stairs. She didn't go up that night. She was too unnerved, but the question gnawed at her. What was Ash trying to show them? And why did it feel less like curiosity and more like urgency? Margaret began keeping a journal. She didn't tell Thomas. He'd think she was being dramatic. But she needed to document Ash's behavior. Every day, she wrote the time he went to the attic stairs, how long he stayed, and whether anything unusual accompanied the ritual. 3 o'clock every afternoon, without fail. On November 12th, she noted something new. Ash had started scratching at the baseboard near the attic door, his claws clicking against the wood in a frantic rhythm. That evening, Thomas agreed to investigate. Together, they climbed the attic stairs while Ash trotted ahead, tail high. The cat moved with purpose, weaving between the shrouded furniture and stopping, once again, at the far wall. Thomas knocked on the paneling. Solid. He checked for loose boards. Nothing. Margaret crouched beside Ash, running her hand along the baseboard. The paint was old, flaking, but intact. "There's nothing here, Maggie," Thomas said gently. "Maybe we should take him to a vet. Animals act strange when they're sick." But Ash didn't look sick. He looked focused. Margaret asked the neighbors about the house. Mrs. Calloway, an elderly woman who'd lived on Ridgewood Lane for 40 years, remembered the Dunbars. "Sweet couple," she said, rocking slowly on her porch. "Kept to themselves. Mrs. Dunbar took ill. Something with her mind, I think. Kept talking about voices in the house. Her husband said it was dementia." She paused, eyes narrowing. "Funny thing, though. They had a cat. Gray thing. Looked a bit like yours." Margaret's stomach tightened. "What happened to it?" Mrs. Calloway shrugged. "Disappeared when they moved out. Figured it ran off." Margaret thanked her and walked home. Mind racing. Could Ash have been the Dunbar's cat? Had he stayed behind when they left? It would explain his familiarity with the house, but it didn't explain the attic. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She lay beside Thomas, listening to the house settle, the creak of beams, the whisper of wind through cracks. Around midnight, she heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping from above. Tap, 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 pause, tap, tap, tap. She sat up, heart pounding. The sound was deliberate, almost musical. She nudged Thomas awake. "Do you hear that?" He mumbled, groggy. "Hear what?" The tapping stopped. "Nothing," she whispered. "Never mind." But Ash heard it. She found him the next morning sitting at the attic door, staring upward, his body tense. When she opened the door, he bolted up the stairs. Margaret followed, her pulse quickening. The attic was freezing, colder than it should have been. Her breath came out in faint clouds. Ash sat at the far wall, motionless, his gaze fixed on a spot just above the baseboard. Margaret knelt beside him. This time, she didn't just look. She pressed her ear to the wall and listened. Silence. Then, faint as a whisper, she heard it. A soft, irregular tapping. Not from inside the wall, from behind it. Her hands shook as she ran her fingers along the paneling, searching for seams, for anything that might indicate a hidden space. Victorian houses were notorious for odd architectural quirks. False walls, sealed-off rooms, forgotten closets. She found a vertical crack, barely visible beneath layers of old paint. She pressed against the panel, and it shifted slightly, as if loose. Margaret's breath caught. "Thomas!" she called down the stairs. "I need your help!" When he arrived, she showed him the crack. Together they pried at the panel with a flathead screwdriver. The wood resisted, then gave way with a splintering crack. Behind it was darkness, a narrow space no more than 3 feet wide, stretching back into shadow. Ash meowed, low and urgent. Margaret grabbed a flashlight from downstairs, her hands trembling. When she shone it into the gap, she saw something that made her blood run cold. A small wooden trunk sat in the hidden space, covered in dust so thick it looked like gray felt. The trunk was old, ancient even, with brass corners green with oxidation, and a rusted latch that hung open. Margaret's flashlight beam trembled as she swept it over the cramped chamber. The space was barely large enough for a person to crouch in, sealed off by the false panel they'd just removed. Someone had deliberately hidden this. Thomas reached in and dragged the trunk forward. It was heavier than it looked, scraping across the floorboards with a grating sound that made Margaret wince. Ash circled the trunk, sniffing intently, his tail flicking. When Thomas opened the lid, the hinges shrieked. Inside were letters, dozens of them, tied in bundles with frayed ribbon. Beneath the letters lay a leather-bound journal. Its cover cracked and stained, and at the very bottom, wrapped in a faded handkerchief, was a small silver locket. Margaret lifted it carefully, her fingers trembling. The locket was tarnished but intact, engraved with delicate scrollwork and a single initial. E. Thomas picked up the journal, flipping through brittle pages filled with tight, slanted handwriting. "These are dated," he said slowly, 1891 to 1893. Margaret opened one of the letters. The paper was yellowed, the ink faded, but the words were still legible. It was addressed to someone named Eliza, written in a looping, romantic hand. The tone was affectionate, almost desperate. The writer, a man named Jonathan, spoke of his love for Eliza, his frustration at their separation, and his hope that they'd be reunited soon. Margaret skimmed through several letters. They all said variations of the same thing: longing, promises, pleas. But the final letter was different. The handwriting was jagged, almost frantic. Jonathan wrote of betrayal, of lies, of Eliza's family forbidding their marriage. He begged her to meet him one last time. He said he couldn't live without her. The letter ended abruptly, unsigned. Margaret set it down, her throat tight. Who was Eliza? Thomas had been reading the journal. His face was pale. I think she lived here, in this house. The journal belongs to her. He turned the journal toward Margaret, pointing to a passage dated October 1893. Eliza described her family: stern, controlling, deeply religious. She wrote of her love for Jonathan, a man her parents deemed unsuitable. She spoke of secret meetings, stolen moments, and a plan to run away together. But the entries grew darker. Eliza wrote of her parents discovering the relationship, of being locked in her room, of Jonathan's letters being intercepted and burned. And then, in the final entry, she wrote, "They say I am ruined. They say I must disappear. Jonathan does not answer my letters. I am alone. God forgive me, I am so alone." The entry ended there. The rest of the journal was blank. Margaret felt a chill crawl up her spine. What happened to her? Thomas shook his head. I don't know. Ash meowed again, sharper this time, and pawed at the floor where the trunk had sat. Margaret shone her flashlight into the hidden chamber. The beam caught something else, a scrap of fabric wedged into a corner, nearly invisible under the dust. She reached in and pulled it free. It was a piece of lace, delicate and rotted, the kind that might have adorned a dress from the late 1800s, and beneath it, scratched into the wooden floor in faint, desperate strokes, was a single word: help. Margaret's hands went numb. She stared at the word, her mind racing. Someone had been trapped in this space, hidden behind a false wall, and they'd tried to signal for rescue. Thomas, she whispered, her voice shaking. I think Eliza never left this house." Ash sat perfectly still, his amber eyes reflecting the flashlight beam, watching them as if waiting for them to finally understand. Margaret couldn't sleep that night. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the discovery in her mind. The letters, the journal, the scratched word. Everything pointed to a tragedy. A young woman imprisoned, possibly left to die. But the house records showed the Dunbars had owned the property since 1920. Before that, it had belonged to a family named Whitmore. Margaret needed to know more. The next morning, she visited the county clerk's office. The records clerk, a bored-looking man in wire-rimmed glasses, led her to a dusty back room filled with ledgers and deed books. Margaret found the entry for 47 Ridgewood Lane. The house had been built in 1889 by Samuel Whitmore, a textile merchant. He lived there with his wife, Constance, and their daughter, Eliza. Eliza Whitmore. The name confirmed what Margaret already suspected. She searched for more. In a separate ledger, she found a brief obituary from November 1893. It stated that Eliza Whitmore, aged 19, had died of scarlet fever. She was buried in Ridgewood Cemetery. The obituary was cold, factual, barely a paragraph. There was no mention of Jonathan. Margaret left the clerk's office with more questions than answers. Scarlet fever was a convenient explanation in the 1890s, vague, common, and difficult to disprove. But the hidden chamber, the desperate letters, the scratched plea for help, they told a different story. That evening, Margaret returned to the attic with Thomas. They brought a crowbar, a stronger flashlight, and a grim determination to uncover the truth. Ash was already waiting at the top of the stairs, his gaze fixed on the false wall. Thomas pried away more of the paneling. Widening the opening, the chamber extended further than they'd realized, a narrow crawl space running along the outer wall of the house. Margaret crawled inside, her flashlight cutting through the dark. The space smelled of rot and something else, something faintly sweet and sickening. Her stomach turned. She swept the beam across the floor and froze. There, pressed against the far corner, partially hidden under a collapsed beam, were bones. Small, delicate bones, unmistakably human. "Thomas!" she called, her voice breaking. "You need to see this." He crawled in beside her, and together they stared at the remains. The skeleton was curled in a fetal position, one hand reaching toward the false wall, as if trying to claw free. Scraps of fabric clung to the bones, remnants of a dress, the lace matching the scrap Margaret had found. And beside the skeleton, half buried in dust, was a second locket, identical to the first. Margaret's hands shook as she picked it up. Inside was a small photograph, faded and cracked. A young woman with dark hair and solemn eyes. On the back, in faint pencil, was written, Eliza Whitmore, 1891. They called the police the next morning. 2 officers arrived, followed by a coroner. The remains were carefully extracted from the hidden chamber and taken for examination. The officers questioned the Harlows, how they'd discovered the space, why they'd been searching. Margaret explained Ash's behavior, though she could see the skepticism in their eyes. Cats didn't solve mysteries, but the evidence was undeniable. The coroner's report came back a week later. The bones belonged to a young woman, approximately 19 years old, who had died in the early 1890s. The cause of death was inconclusive, but the positioning of the remains suggested she had been alive when sealed behind the wall. Starvation or suffocation were likely. The case was classified as a historical homicide, unsolved, but no suspects remained alive to prosecute. Margaret read the report in silence, her chest tight. Eliza Whitmore had been murdered, hidden away by her own family, left to die in the dark, and for over 50 years, no one had known. No one, except Ash. That night, Margaret sat in the attic, the locket in her palm, Ash curled beside her, purring softly, his vigil finally over. Margaret couldn't let it end there. The coroner's report answered how Eliza had died, but not why. She returned to the county archives, digging deeper into the Whitmore family. What she found painted a grim picture. Samuel Whitmore was a respected businessman, but neighbors' accounts from the 1890s described him as rigid and controlling. His wife, Constance, was seen as cold, devoted to social standing above all else. Eliza, their only child, was expected to marry well, a union that would elevate the family's status. But Eliza had fallen in love with Jonathan Hale, a carpenter's apprentice with no money and no prospects. Margaret found records of the Hales in a separate ledger. Jonathan had left Ridgewood in late 1893, abruptly, with no forwarding address. Some speculated he'd gone west. Others believed he'd simply disappeared. Margaret suspected he'd left heartbroken, believing Eliza had abandoned him, unaware of the horror that had befallen her. She found one final document, a letter from Constance Whitmore to a cousin, dated December 1893. In it, Constance wrote, "The matter has been resolved. Eliza's indiscretion will not stain our name. We have done what was necessary." The letter was cold, clinical, devoid of grief. Margaret's hands clenched around the paper. Eliza's parents had sealed her behind that wall. They'd let her die rather than face the scandal of an unsuitable marriage, and they'd buried the truth with a false obituary and a convenient illness. Margaret returned home, the weight of the discovery pressing on her. That evening, she stood in the attic, staring at the now open chamber. The police had removed the remains, but the space still felt heavy, charged with decades of anguish. Ash sat beside her, his amber eyes half closed, calm for the first time since they'd moved in. "You knew, didn't you?" Margaret whispered. "You knew she was here." The cat blinked slowly, then stood and walked to the center of the attic. He sat down, facing the western gable, and meowed once. Soft, almost mournful. Margaret followed his gaze. There, above the false wall, was a small, round window she'd never noticed before. It was grimy, covered in years of dust, but when she wiped it clean, she could see the cemetery in the distance, Ridgewood Cemetery, where Eliza's false grave had been marked. A chill ran down Margaret's spine. Ash had been guiding them not just to Eliza's remains, but toward the truth. Margaret researched the Dunbars next. Mrs. Calloway's mention of their gray cat nagged at her. She found a photograph in an old local newspaper from 1946, showing the Dunbars outside their home. In the background, barely visible on the porch railing, was a gray cat. Margaret compared it to Ash. The resemblance was uncanny, the same uneven whiskers, the same amber eyes. Could Ash be the same cat? It seemed impossible. That would make him at least 15 years old, possibly older. But cats could live that long. And if he'd stayed in the house after the Dunbars left, scavenging and surviving, it would explain why he'd been so thin when Margaret found him. Mrs. Dunbar's deteriorating mental state suddenly made sense. If she'd heard the tapping, if the cat had led her to the attic just as he'd led Margaret, she would have been disturbed, confused, perhaps even terrified. Her husband had dismissed it as dementia. But what if she'd been hearing Eliza's ghost? Or worse, what if she'd heard Ash trying to communicate what he somehow knew? Margaret didn't believe in reincarnation or supernatural bonds, but she couldn't ignore the evidence. Ash had known. From the moment the Harlows moved in, he'd been trying to lead them to Eliza. And now, with her remains finally freed, his urgency had vanished. The mystery was solved, but one question lingered. How had Ash known? Margaret arranged for Eliza's remains to be reburied properly. The Historical Society took an interest in the case, and a small ceremony was held at Ridgewood Cemetery. Margaret placed the locket in the coffin before it was lowered into the ground. It felt right. giving Eliza back the symbol of her stolen love. A local historian researched Jonathan Hale further and discovered he'd died in 1920 in Oregon, unmarried, having spent his life as a carpenter. He'd never known what happened to Eliza. The Harlows decided to stay in the house. Despite its dark history, it was still their home. But Margaret had the hidden chamber sealed permanently, the false wall rebuilt and plastered over. The attic was cleaned, reorganized, and turned into a proper storage space. The children never learned the full story. They were too young. And Margaret saw no reason to burden them with nightmares. They knew only that a sad thing had happened long ago, and now it was made right. Ash changed after the reburial. He no longer went to the attic stairs. He stopped staring at walls, stopped meowing insistently. He became, in every way, an ordinary house cat. Lazy, affectionate, content to nap in sunbeams and chase string. Margaret watched him with a mixture of relief and lingering unease. Part of her wanted to dismiss his earlier behavior as coincidence, as the quirks of an aging stray, but she couldn't. One evening in early December, as snow began to fall outside, Margaret sat in the living room with Ash curled in her lap. She stroked his fur, feeling the steady vibration of his purr. "Who are you? Really?" she whispered. The cat opened one amber eye, gazed at her for a long moment, then closed it again. Thomas believed Ash had simply been reacting to sounds in the walls, rodents, settling wood, the natural acoustics of an old house. David and Lily believed he was magic. Margaret didn't know what she believed, but she thought of Mrs. Dunbar, alone and frightened, hearing tapping in the night. She thought of Eliza, dying in the dark, her pleas for help swallowed by thick walls and familial cruelty. And she thought of Ash, patient and persistent, waiting decades for someone to finally listen. Maybe Ash had been the Dunbar's cat, left behind and surviving on instinct. Maybe he'd explored the house during his time alone, found the hidden chamber by accident, and developed an obsessive habit. Or maybe, just maybe, there were things in this world that couldn't be explained by logic and reason. Bonds that transcended time, guardians who took forms we didn't expect. Margaret never found definitive proof of Ash's age or origins. The Dunbars had passed away before she could ask them about their cat. But she kept the photograph from the newspaper, the one showing the gray cat on their porch. She framed it and hung it in her study, a quiet acknowledgement of the mystery. Ash lived another 3 years. He passed peacefully in his sleep one spring morning, curled in his favorite sunny spot on the living room couch. Margaret buried him in the backyard, beneath the oak tree, and placed a small stone marker with his name. That night, she dreamed of Eliza, young, radiant, standing in a field of wildflowers. Beside her was a gray cat, weaving between her ankles, purring. Eliza looked at Margaret and smiled, and then the dream faded. The house on Ridgewood Lane stands today, repainted and restored, home to a new family. They know nothing of Eliza Whitmore or the hidden chamber. They've never had a cat, but sometimes, late at night, when the wind whistles through the eaves, there's a faint sound, a soft, rhythmic tapping, barely audible, like a memory trying to surface. And in the attic, in the corner where the false wall once stood, the air is always a little colder, as if something once trapped there still lingers, waiting to be remembered.